Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ice Cold Takes podcast. I'm your host, Joey DeMeglio, and this week I'm joined by the creator of the All Three Zones website, Corey Sznajder. If you're a fan of analytics, you've come to the right place because that's what this episode will be all about. I myself am still new to all of this, so I'm excited to learn more and see how it applies to the Rangers this season. Corey, thanks for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. The analytics conversation, I see it a lot on Twitter. People say, oh, the charts don't matter. Go watch the games instead. And then there's people that only post the charts. But I think there's something there of substance, and I want to learn more about it. There's a lot of confusing stuff, so I'm gonna pick your brain a lot if that's okay with you.
Yeah, it's totally fine.
Yeah, I every time I get Drew Way on, I do that. I do that pretty often because I'm fascinated by what's going on with that kind of stuff, especially like the game scores and how the eye test kind of like reinforces the analytics. But I guess to start, you're a Hurricanes fan. I'm a Rangers fan. Let's talk a bit about that second round playoff matchup
You
in
know,
last year's playoffs. Was that a shock to you that the Rangers came out on top?
uh, no, not really. Just because of how Carolina played in the Boston series, they had to struggle and scratch and claw through that one. And like historically, the Rangers have always been kind of a tough matchup for Carolina. Not so much last year; they beat them twice at MSG. So I thought, okay, maybe this is the year they kind of get over those demons. But I don't know. When I saw how the first game went, they didn't really control play as well as they could. The Rangers' third line, the Heedle line, kind of just ran over their depth players. So I thought, okay, this is going to be more of a grind than I thought, and they just got absolutely nuked on special teams. So I I was a little surprised, but not like shocked by it because I think the I don't know, Carolina wasn't playing their best hockey in the playoffs at all, and I just when the Rangers are playing at their best, they can absolutely beat Carolina in 7 games, and that's what happened. Game 7, they got blown out of the building early.
Yeah, that series was very interesting because it was the home team that won every single game up until Game 7. So the last change had the first change had a big impact on the series in terms of matchups on the ice. Advantage had versus I guess the stall line, right? And then
Hmm.
Trocheck was out there too. Carolina seems in the games they won, it seemed like they were just dominating possession, and it was very frustrating as a fan because it was just the only opportunity the Rangers could get was like just a shot, one measly shot like off the rush or a dump and chase, like one turnover. But the losses the Rangers had were kind of dominated by Carolina, and that's what I saw from last year, like during the regular season, and even going back to like the play-in round, the bubble. Like Carolina's a really good team. Like I love some of the players they got on there, like especially Cobb's a beast. Marty Natchez looks like he's going to be a good player.
Yeah, he was the guy that really struggled in that series too, and I did not think he was going to be on the team this year. I thought they might trade him just because he was an RFA, and they weren't entirely sure. Like, I wasn't entirely sure if he was going to be like a part of the team long term, just because he was kind of stuck in that area where it's like you don't know if he's a star or if he's just a very good middle six player, and those are the toughest guys like to pay, especially for a team like Carolina that wants to lock up their core long term. And he just came out of this year all guns a blazing, and it looks like it was a good decision to keep him because I think that line with Kokoniemi and Svechnikov is responsible for like half of their goals. So good decision to keep him so far.
Yeah, so far so good for Marty Natchez on a heater to start the year. But shifting over to talk a little bit about you and the website, all three zones. How did all of that start? You started what 2016, right? Doing tracking all
Yeah,
of that.
yeah. This little project started in 2016, but I've been doing this since like 2012 or so. Just the whole
Right.
microstat tracking, just because, like, it's how I view the game is I like kind of combing over the details of it because, like, as far as like my eye test goes, I don't catch everything. So, kind of going back and looking at some of the details of the game, tracking some of the stats that I think are important. That's just how I kind of learn the game better. And it was something I was doing for my Hurricanes blog, Shutdown Line, back in 2011. And this was only just scoring chances, just who got a scoring chance, who was on ice for scoring chance, and who set them up. It was pretty basic. But then like Eric Tulsky started tracking zone entries, and a bunch of other bloggers were tracking zone exits. So I started weaving that into my analysis, and a lot of people from other teams, or a lot of fans from other teams, were like, I wish we had this for our team. It's like they were just saying they liked reading my blog just because they had all these like extra stats and all these like details about the game, about their team. So I tried doing it for the entire league in 2013, and it had a lot more success than I thought. It was just zone entries and zone exits that I was tracking, but it really took off then. And I had a consulting gig with an NHL team for a couple of years. And going back into the public sphere, I started doing this for the entire league again.
So you actually watch the games and count, like from your eyes, how many times a player crosses the attacking zone, right? Like for the zone entries, you do that all yourself. That's all like manual.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I do. And like it's not as black and white as that, because like I do track just because I do track whether like it was carried in, dumped in. I don't track line changes. If there's just the doldrums of the game, if it's like 5-0, I don't really track that,
Right.
just because like I have a lot of work to do, a lot of data to do. I'm not going to track blowouts like when the game is basically over. But yeah, I do track those manually. And like as like the more time I've done this, the more kind of streamlined I've made the process. Like what I do now is I load the shots beforehand, like the play-by-play sheets, just to get an idea of how the game is going. And I just get an idea of where the most of the action is, where the scoring chances happen, where there's like a lull in the action that I can kind of skip over. So that's really made my whole process quicker these past couple of years.
I see. So you went with zone entries, you take into account whether they thump the puck in or cross the blue line with possession of the puck, and then exits if they carry it out or pass it to a teammate, right?
Yeah, that's how I used
Yeah.
to track X. It's a little different now. Now I'm tracking if the defenseman successfully like retrieves the puck in the defensive zone or gets knocked off of it, and whether that leads to an exit. Just because when I was tracking exits before, tracking a lot of like I was tracking a lot of noise, because there's a lot of times where a defenseman just skates the puck out uncontested, and there's not really any reason to track that, because like I don't know, taking 5 strides with the puck and getting out of the and just crossing your own blue line. Like I don't really think that's a skill. Like, and almost anybody can do that.
Mhm.
Whereas like if you have to beat a forecheck, I think that tells you a lot more about how good a defenseman is and how good teams are.
Right. It provides significance for the stat. I see what you're saying. And what other stats do you track?
Um, well, with the shot and passing data that I track,
Mhm.
I track the shots and who set up the shots. I also track like the area they come from, whether it's from the right side, the neutral zone, defensive zone, and I also track whether it came off the rush, the cycle, or the forecheck, just to see how teams attack, where they're getting most of their goals, where they're getting most of their offense, whether they're like reliant on the rush or if they're a good forechecking team, because I think that is a pretty big factor, especially in the playoffs. So it's a lot of like the past 2 years or so, I've added a lot more contextual data on top of like the basic stuff that I've been tracking for years, and I think it's come a long way. It's like I have player cards now that give you all this data about like what a player is good at, what they struggle with, and I also track entry defense. That's something I've always tracked. In the past couple of years, I've added whether or not they've allowed a defenseman allows a scoring chance when a team enters the zone against them. And I've also added forechecking data just to see how often a player disrupts a zone exit, which it's also something I feel like that matters more in the playoffs than the regular season, because there's a lot of during the regular season you have a lot more lulls in the action and a lot of like plays where teams just peel off. Whereas like in the playoffs, there's a lot more. The intensity is up a lot more. Botched breakouts and stuff matter a lot more. Botched retrievals matter a lot more, and the forecheck pressure a lot. The forecheck pressure definitely adds to that. So I look at which players are succeeding in that. That's something that the guys Colorado added at the deadline do very well, like Arturi Lehkonen.
So who else like kind of like stands out from like your from what you've tracked? You mentioned Lekanen, but who else?
A lot of those Tampa Bay guys do, especially like that's something that like Alex Killorn has always been really good at. Yanni Gord has been a guy that's Yanni Gord. That's a guy that's always been really good at this,
Hmm.
even after he got traded to Seattle. And he's more of a guy there than just a depth player, but he's still like a lot of the he still like kind of is the catalyst for a lot of their offense just because of where their team talent is. But it's because he's so good at retrieving the puck, getting it back, and kind of setting up the offense from there. And it's always that's where it's kind of frustrating, like when you go from like the analyst or you go from like the analyst's point of view to like the coach's point of view, because it's like a guy like Yanni Gord you always want on your team, but if you're like the front office, it's like, do you want Yanni Gord on your team for 7 years at $5 million? So then it becomes kind of a tricky when you have to pay like six other guys. So then it becomes kind of trickier to kind of integrate the two into there. I mean, you have to integrate the two sides into that. But yeah, a lot of those Tampa Bay guys have always really stood out, especially in forechecking.
Yeah, so you brought up like Gord's contract, and that was interesting. So the a couple years ago, when Tampa Bay lost that entire third line, Coleman, Gordon, and Goudreau, you think Gord was like the play driver on that line, right? So compared to his value, like where do like Coleman and Goudreau stand in terms of like their value to a team, especially Goudreau because he plays for the Rangers.
Yeah, it's interesting because they all three of them do different things. Like Yanni Gord does a lot more with the puck, like mostly because he plays center. He's the one going back in and out of the zone, and the one that's setting up most of the plays and getting a lot of those dirty goals. But they each kind of do different things. Like Blake Coleman's always been one of the best forecheckers in the league too, but he's very good off the rush. That's it kind of adds a different element to his game. Like even in New Jersey, he was really good at creating off the rush. It's just a matter of he's not like the most skilled player. He can't finish as much. Whereas like Barclay Goudreau was more kind of just the high. Well, he was kind of doing the basic things. He was either a high forward or kind of just the one going out to just going in to get the puck. But he had probably the lowest roll with the puck out of those three. Like it's not really a knock on him. It's more just like the other two are better. So yeah, of course they're going to be the ones leading the
Hmm.
charge there. But he had more of kind of an ancillary role compared to the other two. Like more of a
Hmm.
just he did more of the basics than the other two who had more of a skill that's tougher to find.
Yeah, and I think the value of the analytics is kind of like paying off because Gord got a huge contract with Seattle, and I think a lot of Rangers fans in years past, myself included, have wanted like a Gord for to be like a third or a second line center for the team. It's just impossible because of like the contract, and there's a lot of issues with the salary cap. My next question was, does your site track like expected goals for and against that kind of thing, or
Uh,
no?
I don't do that mostly because I'm more of just like the watch the tape and track data type of mindset than like the math mindset.
Hmm.
That's just how I've always learned. And then there's like three other sites that do expected goals already, so I don't really want to add to the whole noise there. And I like using my data as like a complement to the other sites just to kind of explain what's happening just because
Hmm.
that's how I've always learned.
So
And that's
expected. Would you say like expected goals for and against are not the most accurate in terms of like describing how good a player is or isn't?
Um, it's less that they're accurate and more if it's just like if you tell me that, say, like, okay, Chris Kreider has an expected goals for of 44, it just doesn't really it doesn't help me a lot as a fan. You're just telling me a player is bad and he has a high shooting percentage. And I don't know, it doesn't really, I don't know. I feel like sometimes it kind of gets lost, but that's also just kind of the nature of the beast when you're especially on social media where you just post one thing and you kind of expect it to have people can take it like five or six different ways when there's a lot of things that happen in the game and a lot of things that a player does like that can fill a certain role or do a certain thing that helps your team more than just like they're creating this much they're then like their team is controlling like 45% of the expected goals when they're on the ice. So I think it's definitely accurate, but you're also looking at what happens when they're on the ice and it's based off play by play data, which sometimes it can be messy, but across the league, it's not. I, I feel like the differences are a little like negligible just because just because it's so small across the league. There's a few things here and there. Although the more I've been tracking data, the more I've been finding just like shots that don't exist and rebounds that are overcounted across the league. So
Mhm.
I do think that kind of cancels itself out over time. But I also think like it tells you what's happening when a player is on the ice, but it doesn't really tell you everything about a player exactly. Because like what his line mates do matters, what situation he's in matters, the score matters too. But yeah, like what I do, I feel like it just helps a fan like me more that
Mhm.
wants to like know exactly like what is happening when it's like what's happening during a game. Because like zone entries kind of feed into that with zone entries feed into that because it tells you like the flow of the game. Because the team that's entering the zone more, like they're on the attack more. They're and especially if they're carrying the puck in more, they're coming at you with speed a lot more. So that tells you they're kind of controlling the play. But if they're not scoring goals, it's telling you the other team might be defending more or getting good goaltending. So I just feel like it helps me more as an analyst and as a fan because that's just how I've always learned, like just from practical events.
And there's other stats that you could track to get a good understanding of a player. And sometimes I guess transitioning to our next topic, like about the eye test versus the analytics. Sometimes I feel like there's a disconnect between the two. And as an example, the Capo Caco, I think he's looked great so far to start the season. In the very first game, I thought he was outstanding. When I checked natural stat trick after the first game, his goals for percentage was like less than 50%. It was worst second worst on the team. So I was just like confused. Like, can you talk about that? Like, what else can you look at as a fan or as an analyst to see which analytics stand out more than the others?
Yeah, like with one game, you're going to get especially a bunch of noisy data because when you think of how many shots a player is on the ice for the game, it's like 20 tops. So it's like
Hmm.
10 his way, 10 the other way, 5 his way, 15 the other way. And with expected goals, the sample size is even smaller because like there's only maybe 3 total expected like the expected goal total is maybe like 3.5 per game total. So when you nail it down to that much, you're going to get a lot of noisy data in a one game sample that doesn't always like capture
Right.
everything because there might be a shift where say Kako is like digging the puck out, creating a lot of zone time, but not getting any shots, so he doesn't get any credit like on the score sheet. So and it's also like sometimes a player might have a like an expected goal of like say 0.58 and expected goal against of like 0.79 and it's not going to look great in terms of percentages, but it's also kind of you're talking like a difference of like 1 or
Hmm.
2% at the end of the day. So it doesn't really so like one game you're going to get a little like murkier stats whereas like with micro stats there's a lot more that goes into it. There's a lot more data that goes into it exactly like you have zone entries, you have zone exits, forecheck pressures, passes, just all of these things that kind of go into the equation and you can kind of nail into you can kind of get into like what exactly he did in all of his shifts. Like you can find like passes that he set up, plays that he could have set up or just weren't there, plays that he missed on, plays that got screwed over by a teammate missing the shot or just going over his stick or something like that. So like with the data I track, there's a lot more you can look at, which can kind of get messy sometimes because you can kind of you kind of like get lost looking at the details and not and missing the big picture. But we're so early in the season now
Yeah.
that I think looking at the details is kind of what you're stuck with until you get to like game 20.
Right, so it's hard to look at it, especially for what you're saying, it's hard to look at that kind of stuff just for one game, so don't jump to conclusions as a fan, I would say, just hearing your explanation on that. And then also logging, I guess, the amount of time you spend in the offensive zone is probably, a big contributor towards, like, the analytics. Like you said, if you have more zone entries, if know successful zone entries, that is. I think last year the Rangers were like middle of the pack or towards the bottom and like zone entries, the successful ones. You could correct me on that, but I remember it was like something about dumping and chasing. They did it so much more than the average team. Has there been a change so far this year? I know it's only been like less than 10 games, but I feel like as a fan, I've noticed a lot of times like they're carrying it in a little bit more often than they were last year. Can you comment on that?
I can pull up my numbers quickly because I've tracked everything except the last two games. I haven't done the Islanders game yet, but I've watched a lot of the games that I've watched most of the games that they won, and they looked good in those games for the most part.
Oh yeah, the very beginning of the season, I think I
Oh
was
yeah,
expecting to see more of that. Like through the first two games, that Minnesota game, they completely dominated that game.
yeah. Even
Even the
against Winnipeg when they lost that game,
second.
that was going back and forth like crazy. Like they
Hmm.
were like they created a ton of offense in that game. But yeah, I'm actually looking at it now, and they're carrying the puck in 53.4% of the time, which is very good.
Okay.
Like that would
Yeah.
a few years ago that'd be like among the best in the league. Now it's like in the top 10, which like we're still working with small sample sizes, but going back to last year, like the league is getting more skilled now. Fourth lines don't always dump the puck in now. Defensemen carry the puck in more than they used to. So I think you're seeing kind of a rise in the you're seeing a rise in like how often teams are carrying the puck in. It's been a slow like climb to that though. But yeah, the Rangers have been pretty good carrying the puck in the games I've done at least. But last year it was interesting because when they scored, they always carried the puck in. They were very good at counterattacking and
Off
kind of
the
getting that
yeah,
quick
okay.
strike offense.
Hmm.
But when they dumped the puck in, they didn't create a lot. I don't know if that was by design because just from watching them last year, like I kind of made a focus to watch a lot more, just to watch them a lot more, just to see what exactly was going on because there was like a huge disconnect in their on ice results and their underlying stats. But like from what I saw was that the Rangers they got a lot of early leads and they kind of just parked it after that. They had a lot of shifts where just nothing happened. And I think that was
Hmm.
kind of designed by Gallant. And it got better after the trade deadline when they got Andrew Kopp and Tyler Mott, just because those guys can play that grinding style better than some of the other guys they were playing early in the year. Like they had a lot of AHLers in their bottom six early in the season. But this year it seems like they're playing with a lot more pace and a lot more skill now. And it's actually so one of the newer stats that I've been tracking is how often a team gets a scoring chance off a zone entry. So I feel like this is something, just because I feel like that's something that can tell you how the major plays in the game go. Because a lot of goals, if they're happening off carry-ins, they're happening off the rush nowadays, and they're happening very quick too. So um, with with that, you can look at how exactly like the pace of the game is going. And even by that last year, the Rangers weren't great, but that's just because they had a lot of shifts where nothing happened. It's like they would get those carry-ins, but they would score on them, but there would only be like 10 or 15 of them per game, and they would score on three of them, which and nowadays, especially when you have Shesterkin, that's enough to get by.
Hmm.
It's just very tough to repeat.
Right. That kind of success isn't sustainable. But what you're saying about the zone entries and the scoring chances off those entries, is that like immediate or is that just scoring chances off the zone entry period? Like whether they
Off
cycle it or if they just charge the net and get a like a cross creaser or something like that.
It's off both, just because
Yeah.
when I first started doing this, hang on one second, my dog is at the door.
All right, we'll pause here for our ad break. I'll just remember to cut this out.
Sorry about that.
Yep, no problem. We are back. But go ahead.
So yeah, when I first started doing this, it was a lot of I was testing like how often, just how successful carry-ins are in terms of creating scoring chances, and how often teams kind of wasted those. So I was looking at whether or not they cycled it, whether or not they kind of like skated it to the corner and kind of created off that. And I was also looking at just the success of like dump and chase too, like just how good teams are kind of creating chances off forechecks. And this year I've added a new wrinkle. I'm looking at like how often a chance starts in the defensive zone, how often it starts off a neutral zone regroup, how often it starts off a cycle. So that's going to be something I'm looking at a lot more in depth this year.
And
Just
that's
how
that's
often
okay, go ahead.
those real quick strike plays happen.
And so those are represented in what, like a table or a bar graph? How is that for those that haven't seen the way you publish your data?
So
How
so personally, I like doing scatter plots to kind of look at. So basically, you look at how each team compares to the league average, offensively and defensively, and you kind of get a like a parameter of where they are in both areas of the game, both in creating and preventing. And that's just the way that's the way I've learned best, because you also look at how close teams are to the league average, and there's a lot that are very close together, and there's like maybe one or two that are up like just killing it compared to the rest of the league. And there's
Mhm.
a lot more that are. It's interesting because with this, there's a lot more teams that are on the bad quadrant than there are good. So it seems like if you're a team that just excels in transition, seems like you're always kind of just running away with the rest of the league. Like Colorado has always been good at this. Tampa Bay has always been very good at it. Florida was one of the best in the league last year. It didn't work out for them in the playoffs,
Mhm.
obviously, but they they set like a record in terms of points in the regular season, so it did work then.
Yeah, right. So you could through the scatter plot, you could kind of see where your team is at and compared to the rest of the league in that department. But shifting back a little bit more, talking about just the eye test versus the analytics as a whole, should they reinforce each other or do they reinforce each other in your eyes? I mean, you're watching the game, so you're getting this data like from yourself. I know there's like the venue adjusted thing, so I was going to ask you about that as well after, but let's talk a little bit about, you know, that whole debate. Like, I know it matters, the analytics. Yes, you shouldn't discredit it at all. I think you should consider it. But for someone that doesn't follow the charts, what would you say to them?
So, I mean, it's to me, it goes back to whether or not you're just like a fan or you're like an analyst or something. Like, it depends on how you enjoy the game, to me, at least. Because if you're a fan that does not care about like stats at all, that's fine. Like, I think that's something a lot of people in the community kind of struggle with. But I also get it just because if you're presenting stuff out there and you're on Twitter, it's like you assume that your audience kind of subscribes to like the same viewpoints as you and uses this data. But me personally, like they do obviously go hand in hand, but the stats to me say like if somebody posts a chart that says like, hey, the Rangers are very good or they're very bad, it's like, okay, they're saying this is happening. So for me as an analyst, I'm like, okay, why is it happening? What are they doing to like have to like make these results happen? And that's where like the microstat tracking and digging into the film kind of goes. And there's also other people like Jack Hahn and others who kind of dig into the systematic play of teams, who are more of like of the coaching background. And that's kind of so like all these things kind of work together to tell you what. But also there's also just like the mindset of like you have to like use one or the other or think a certain way to kind of be a hockey fan, it seems like these days, and that's just not the case.
Right.
Because like if somebody does not care like about stats at all, that's fine, and I think that's something a lot of people like in my community kind of struggle to accept. Because like if I'm especially like the Rangers last year, it's like you just got out of a rebuild and you're having all this success, you're winning a lot of games in the regular season. Some guy just comes online and says, hey, don't be happy about it because you're giving up 45 shots a game and your goaltender's playing on his head. It's like, I don't know, as a fan, I'm gonna be like, okay.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I just kind of see it like, because like I'm a football fan too, and I don't follow a lot of like the stats in there. But if somebody tells me that like somebody is telling me like, oh yeah, the Bengals run last year totally smoke and mirrors, like I'm going to tell them, yeah, I kind of knew that just because they were 1-14 the previous year. Of course, I know they're not going to be great, and that they had a lot of things go their way. But I'm not going to like, I don't know, throw a fit over it.
I like that you bring up the fans' perspective too, like because yeah, that's exactly how a lot of us felt. You know, it felt good to win a lot of games, but at the same time, you know, you think about the events that played out in all those games that we won, especially towards the beginning of the year when 5v5 play was basically non-existent. And Shesterkin just standing on his head was an actual brick wall behind there. the reason why he won Vezina and was considered a Hart Trophy candidate last year. But then, like to factor in the analytics, you want to dominate play. Like I want to be my team. I want my team to be like Colorado. Like I want to be in on every forecheck. Like I want my players skating as hard as they can, like getting opportunity after opportunity. That's what excites me as a fan, and I hope one day that maybe the Rangers can realize this because they do have a lot of skill and talent. And do you think them injecting like Lafreniere, Kako into the top six finally has allowed them to carry that zone entry percentage by carrying it up to like what was it 53% you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you
Mhm.
think putting those two players in the spots that they need to be playing in is contributing to that, or is that just a whole complete overhaul of the offensive system that Gallant is putting in place?
Yeah, I think a lot of their young players are starting to kind of come into their own there. And I also think adding Trocheck helps because Trocheck in Carolina, at least, he was. So Carolina is a very forecheck heavy team, but he was one of the few that actually was allowed to kind of skate the puck into the zone a lot more. And what he did a lot more was kind of create off cycles. But he also, I think he's been playing with Panarin a lot early in the season too. And
Yep.
he, from what I saw, he differs to Panarin a lot just because that's what you do if like you have if you're a hockey player with a working brain cell, you defer to the best guy on the ice. But Panarin usually leads a lot of their offense in this. But um, I feel like Heedle's also kind of taken a step forward there. He's always been a really strong player on zone entries, and this
Oh
year
yeah.
he's barely dumping the puck in at all, which I think is a good sign if you're a Rangers fan, because that gives you kind of a that gives you a good it gives you like a good depth piece there. And I think having depth players who can do that goes a long way and goes a long way for you because I don't know where Heedle is in the lineup exactly, but if he's playing third line minutes, he's out against third line players and depth defensemen, and a lot of those
Hmm.
guys struggle to handle speed. So that adds like a new wrinkle. But it's interesting because I'm looking over their numbers now, and Kako's actually dumping the puck in a lot more. But from what I've seen of him too, is that he creates a lot off the forecheck, and he's very good in the corners. So I think that might be him kind of playing to his strengths. But I think also it's the Rangers have always been just a weird team in this, even going back to when Quinn was there, because a lot of it revolves around Panarin and everybody else kind of play. It's like Panarin's allowed to do what he does, and everybody else, it's like north
Yeah.
south hockey. This year, I think it might be more of the same, but it might be a little more speed focused. And it's interesting. Like one thing, the new thing that I'm tracking this year with like where chances come from, like defensive zone, neutral zone, counterattacks, and all that. I think this might tell me a lot about the Rangers because from what I saw, they're controlling play a little better than they were this year. But I do wonder if that might have an effect on how they play because they scored so much off the counter last year. So it's like the problem with counters is you have to survive a defensive zone breakdown or a defensive zone sequence in order to get them. And they're regrouping a lot this year, and it's tougher to score off of those if you're so used to just catching a defense off guard. Because if you're regrouping, that means the other team has time to get set up. At least that's what I saw when they were playing the Sharks last week. Like they were peeling back a lot after they cleared the zone. They weren't attacking. So I do wonder if this is kind of a new thing that they're going to get used to and they'll get better at over the season, or if they're going to revert to how they played last year, where it's like they have to kind of catch a defense off guard and have a guy streaking the zone or catch a defenseman falling down to create their offense.
There's that game against the Sharks is the first of 4 consecutive losses now for the Rangers at the time of this recording. This is Thursday, so episode goes out on Saturday, of course. But a lot of people kind of flipping out that the Rangers are getting lots of shots in their games. This is the most I've seen the team shoot since I've started watching in 2010. It doesn't matter who the coach was. Like, they just had peppered Sorokin with 41 shots, and he stopped them all against the Islanders on Wednesday night. Um, Georgiev stood on his head again, or not again, but like for the first time against the Rangers in his return to the Garden on Tuesday night. They lost in a shootout. Is this like, and the Rangers haven't scored on the power play either, too. So maybe that's kind of the reason why there's a discrepancy in the data because they always relied on Kreider to score those tipping goals, like what 26 power play goals last year. So I'm just wondering, like, does there come a point in time where the chances become more than chances and then they become goals? Like when does that like does that data like kind of correlate? Does it hint at when a surge in goals is going to break out or when it's going to not happen?
Usually, yes. Like Colorado went through similar struggles earlier last year, and they're doing it again this year. That Colorado's actually near the bottom of the league in 5-on-5 goals, despite creating as much offense as they do. But usually, there's a point where things regress towards where the team's talent level is. Like with a team like Carolina, we've seen this for years. They're a team that just piled up shots forever, but they also took a lot of point shots. They relied on deflections, a lot of rebounds, a lot of scrambles, and their skill level wasn't that great. So their expected shooting percentage is lower than the league average, where the Rangers, they were the opposite for the longest time. They got few shots, but the shots they did get, they scored on.
Because
And
they're
this
always
year,
passing, right?
yeah, like that's the Ranger. It was more of a thing under Quinn than Gallant. Quinn was a very big wait for the high danger pass to open up and then shoot, which kind of limited their overall offense. But this year they're getting more shot volume, which might have an effect on how many goals you expect from them. Just because you take more shots, you're not going to score on 10% of them like they were last year. It might be more like 8%. So it might be so the goals will come, but it might be a lower total than last year, especially with Kreider, because like the thing with tip in chances and rebounds is that they're high quality shots, but there's like a 50% chance of whether or not they even hit the net. So it's very feast or famine with a guy like him. But they also have Artemi Panarin, and Panarin historically has been one of the best, arguably the best passer in the league, the best guy at improving shot quality for like any team he's been on, like even Columbus. So I would expect that to improve. I do wonder like what the cap is though, especially as guys like Lafreniere and Kako kind of figure out what they are exactly as pros.
Right. So and also Kako Lafreniere, I got to ask you about this. Are they busts or is it still wait and see? You got to see how this year plays out for you.
I'm giving them this year because last year was such a weird year for Lafreniere because he did a lot of good things in the defensive zone to get the puck out, but like any non Zibanejad Panarin Ranger was in the toilet in terms of like shot volume and passing and just overall offense. And he fell into that class. And but in the playoffs, it looked like he really came into his own,
Hmm.
especially like he was on a line with Heedle. They got a chance to kind of play their game a lot more, striking in transition. They played a lot more in the offensive zone too. So I do want to see if that kind of stays consistent for the entire season. With Kako, I think his ceiling might be a little lower. He might just be like a shot volume type of player, scores a lot of dirty goals rather than like the high end like game breaker that he might have been projected to be. Lafreniere, I'm not entirely sure about yet, just because he was stuck in kind of a weird role last year, and he's been very. I don't know. I think we kind of expect these kids to develop like their McDavid and Hughes,
Right.
and that's just not the norm. So if so, I think maybe they'll have a different. I think they'll have a different career trajectory than a lot of other prospects. But it's also like it depends on what your definition is of a bust too. Because if Kako is say a very good second line forward, is that a bust or
I
is that
would.
just a disappointment?
No, I just by a bust, I mean, like, I think people consider or looking at like you brought up about, like, McDavid or Hughes or, like, a Austin Matthews, where as soon as they come into the league, they're lighting it up. Well, Kakko and Lafreniere haven't done that, and you just look at their point totals, and it leaves a lot to be desired, of course, yeah, for fans, but, like, I still look at their play, especially at the start of this year. Lafreniere's looked good with, Panarin since Kravtsov got injured in the first game. I think those 2 should be together. I think it's a good combination there. And then going back to your point about Kako, why he dumps the puck in, I tend to notice that Kreider's advantage at in adopting that north south style of play. Kreider's a north south player. That's when he's at his best. As fans, we've noticed that he's at his best when he skates in straight lines instead of going east or west with passes or anything. So I've just noticed that that line as a whole, it doesn't matter who's on the right wing. They just tend to they dump the puck in a little bit more. Um, a couple last questions for you before we wrap this up. So for those that are like all about the eye test but want to get into some of the analytics, those such as myself, that is like, what's one stat that is particularly noteworthy other than zone entries and exits? What is one stat that's particularly noteworthy or important and is somewhat easy to comprehend?
I always go back to the basics. It's looking at how a player does relative to his ice time, whether that's goals, assists, points. Like I want to see, like I know points aren't like the NBL at the end of the day, but I do want to see if like they're producing, like at the end of the day when it comes to like what they're doing. So I look at like points per 60 a lot just to see, okay, are they like, okay, are they producing? Like, is this why they're getting moved up and down the lineup? And if they're not producing, then you can look at what they're doing in terms of like controlling play, whether that's looking at shot differential, like shot percentage, I feel like is fair. I feel like that still has its place because you're looking at what's happening when what's on the ice when they're out there. So a player like Val Nichushkin for years, he struggled to score goals, but he was always very good at controlling play. And then eventually the offense came around for him. So I think kind of using those two together as like a starting point is always good. But like with my data, like the problem with my data is that it's not a complete set all the time because like I have to track all these games and I'm not going to have everything like up to the minute. So, but once you get to a good sample size, like I think I like looking at like how they're producing offense and whether or not they're producing chances. So, like with my player cards, you see shots, primary shot assists, which is just another word for setup passes, and then below that you'll see chances and chance assists. So you can look at if a player is producing a lot of offense but not getting a lot of reward for it, you can look at chances and see, oh, okay, they're setting up a lot of perimeter shots and not getting a lot of great chances. So there's something they could be doing better. So I think looking at just starting with the basics and kind of weaving the rest in is the way to go if you're looking to get into more advanced stats.
I can't believe I'm about to ask this, but and I think Ranger fans are going to kill me for this, but Julian Gauthier got called up uh, before last night's game against the Islanders, and he made an immediate impact. And he's a guy that I feel has always had these just tremendous high danger chances. He's always drawing penalties, but he could never finish. Does his like do his numbers like somewhat compared to like what Nichushkin was at that stage in his career, or is that just a completely albatross comparison?
It's a little off just because
Yeah.
Nichushkin was an NHL player when
Okay.
he was 18 and he had hip injuries that kind of derailed his development. Gauthier just has I don't know if he's an NHLer. And he was in the league last year for a
Yeah.
fair bit,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, he was a that was a ex Carolina first round pick. But with him, I do wonder if he has the hands to kind of finish a lot of those plays or just the patience or the touch to just convert on a lot of the chances he creates. Because with especially in Charlotte, he created a lot of offense like basically in the crease. And doing that against NHL goalies is tougher than against AHL
Mhm.
goaltenders, and especially against you have a lot from what I've watched like in the AHL, you have a lot more time to kind of finish those plays off. Whereas like in the NHL, you'll have a defenseman just bearing down right
Stop
on
you
you like
right
within
away.
2 seconds. So it's a stiffer learning curve. We had a like Caroline had a similar player, Valentin Zikov, a few years
Yeah.
ago, and he was very similar to Gauthier. He was not a great skater, but he created a lot of offense down low, but he always struggled to finish in the
Mhm.
NHL. And a lot of it just because he creates a lot of offense in the dirty areas, which usually it leads to more goals, but it's not always an apples to apples comparison from AHL to NHL just because the level of competition is so much tougher. And there's not a lot of guys who can kind of beat a goaltender with one shot like in this league now.
Mhm.
So it's a tough skill set. Like it's gold when you find it, but it's also basically impossible to find. So if he can learn to kind of be better like in the doldrums of the game, controlling play and kind of creating off passes, using his teammates more. That's kind of where I think he'll take that next step, because that's where Nichushkin really has improved. Like since he got to Colorado, because like they've slowly worked him up the lineup, turning him from a four checker to a top sixer, and kind of developing chemistry with the top players on that team, and it's just kind of come naturally to him. Whereas with Gauthier, I'm not sure if he'll get there, but I do think he'll be an NHLer at the very least, because like there's always a place for a guy like that if he can learn to like play the NHL way and just kind of settle into his game, even if he's
Mhm.
not going to be a scorer.
So sometimes it's not always about just being in that spot to have that sort of chance, like the high danger chances, lots of breakaways, lots of dips around the defenseman, missed breakaway opportunities, stuff like that, odd man rushes. But if he doesn't have the skills to, finish those chances, then there's probably not a place for him in the lineup. I'm just assuming that's why he didn't make the team at camp and why Kravtsov was there. Now he's up because I think Kravtsov's got an upper body injury, but um, I had to throw in Gauthier because a lot of people like to talk about him and that how he's basically a meme on offense because he can't bury any goals. And then same thing from the defensive side is like Libor Hayek. I can't not mention him when we're talking about analytics. He's just wonderful, isn't he?
I don't I don't understand him. I like how tall is he? Because he looks like he's 5'5" whenever he plays, just because he's always hunched over and gives a free pass into the offensive zone all the
He's
time.
he is 6'2".
I I don't believe that. He looks like
Right,
he's under 6 feet.
right.
Like whenever I watch him, just from his posture. Like I noticed him. This was more in the Quinn years though. Like last year, I felt like he was used a lot more. Like not necessarily properly, but sparingly last year.
It's just sad because, like, he was once like, these players that we were talking about, like Nichushkin, at least he panned out, like, Zykov and Gauthier and Hayek, they were, like correct me, I don't know, I think Zykov was, like, a second rounder, wasn't he? Like, he was once
Yeah.
a pretty good prospect in among his draft class. I
Hmm.
remember when he was around this I think it was 2014 when he was drafted. I remember that name. Hayek was once a highly touted prospect, like, the Rangers wanted him in that deal for McDonough, and then just to see it, like, all fall apart, fall flat on its face is sad, especially for fans too, because we think we're getting something. Hayek looked promising within his first couple games as a Ranger, gets hurt, and then he's just never the same after that. Um, it's just, it's, like, unfortunate, and some of those guys could never recover, and then, again, a guy like, Nichushkin is proven to be a great asset to Colorado. Um,
Yeah, I do wonder if like the environment they come up in is also a
yeah,
thing, because like Hayek was developing on a Rangers team that was like in full rebuild mode
yeah.
and playing a lot of minutes too. So I just do wonder if bad habits kind of seep in easier to those types of players, because he's not the only player to have a promising start to his career and kind of just get it derailed
Right,
from just
I'm
yeah.
sure there's a lot of guys you could name that fit that description. One last question before we wrap it up. Just overall thoughts on the Rangers. I don't know how many of the games you've seen. You told me you were watching the Sharks game, so that was what, like, maybe 4 or 5 games in to the schedule. That third period collapse in that game was completely brutal.
Yeah, they've looked okay so far. Like I think that's the best way to describe it. It's like they've looked fine. Like I think they're going to be in the playoffs like at the end of the day, and I think the rest of the division is it's a really good right place, right time for them,
Mhm.
because Washington has not looked great to start the year, and it's like Carolina's going to be there. Philadelphia's rebuilding. I don't know if the Devils are good yet. They're just way too much on the high and the low end for me. Whereas like the Rangers, I feel like they haven't been just totally dominated in any games I've watched yet. So I think that's just kind of where I'm at with them. The game against Winnipeg was kind of a concerning. That was a bit of a wild one, but
Yeah.
it's been interesting. It's been interesting because like I've against Tampa Bay and against Minnesota, I felt like they looked like they did last year. And I that Sharks game, I don't really know what exactly happened. I'm surprised they couldn't score in those early two power plays, but San Jose has also been perfect on the penalty kill this year. Surprisingly,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that's like one thing they've always gotten right in San Jose. Is just they're very good at killing penalties, but I think they're still working out some of their kinks in the roster. It's like I mentioned earlier, they're a team that's so used to kind of having their goaltender bail them out and striking on the counterattack when teams are tired. So I do wonder if there's a bit of a learning curve with being a team that's controlling play a little more, but also having to beat more structured defenses. Because like you might be controlling play, but a team can also stay in their structure and like defend you like in the
Hmm.
neutral zone or the defensive zone and front shots and things like that. So I do think there might be a bit of a learning curve there, especially with their defensemen. I think that's going to be interesting because like Adam Fox is a unicorn with just how good he is at controlling the points, and
Yeah.
uh, I think like that's one area I'd like to see Keandre Miller take some improvements in, because he's very good at disrupting plays, like using his stick to break up entries and just putting out fires in the defensive zone. But I do want to see him be a little more creative offensively, like on plays that aren't rushes. So I think that's like an area I'd like to see him take a step forward. Same with like the Braden Schneiders of the world, and that's that's kind of where I'm expecting. That's where I think they have like the most room to improve. Like how can they be better with in zone offense? Because like I said, they should be scoring more goals eventually. It's just a matter of whether or not they kind of figure out this new way to play that they're kind of in right now.
I see. Yeah, so I mean, it's still pretty early though too, so it's hard to
Exactly.
it's hard to get a gist out of the like a good understanding of the data that you have, right? Because the math's not gonna work out. Like you brought up the Devils, it's like too much high and low. I heard that they were really good at 5v5, but I mean, I don't know if they still have those goaltending issues.
They
They did make an upgrade, but it's not too significant, I don't think.
Yeah, it's I don't know. They play such a back and forth game, and I think they got better like on the blue line this year, like just getting a guy like Marino to kind of
Mhm.
calm things down a little bit, play less fire wagon hockey. But the goaltending is just brutal there. I don't know if that's gonna like I don't know. That's either gonna sort itself out or be a problem all season. I don't.
Mhm.
It's not gonna be anything. It's not gonna be anything like in between there. But I don't know. The Devils remind me a lot of when Carolina was starting to get good, and it was just a matter of getting the goaltending
Mhm.
situation right. And Carolina found something with like Peter Mrazek, who was one step away from being out of the league. So you never know how this is going to go.
Right. Yeah, and I think the goalie situation is more likely to play out as a long-term season like full season kind of problem than like where the Rangers problem is like with their defenders, what you said in zone offense. Uh Also I think like, the opposing team's got to get their chances somewhere. So I think it's most likely when it's the bottom two lines, forward lines are out there, or at least when the fourth line is out there, because Reeves is on there, and then when the third pair of defenders are out there, especially if Hayek's there. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're gonna be pinned in your zone at some point, especially like when Hayek is out there. That's what I've noticed. Like, you drop the puck first two shifts. Truba comes out, Fox comes out, and then no puck's not in the Rangers' end, and then as soon as Hayek steps out there, you see at least like 5 seconds in the Rangers. And not saying that like something bad happens, but that's just what happens. It's
yeah,
the
and
weakest link.
yeah, and I think that's where a guy like Miller and Fox are really valuable there, just because they can put out fires in the defensive
Mm.
zone pretty easily. Like Fox is very good at like stripping the puck, and Lindgren's also very good at doing that. Well, Lindgren's very good at just making sure it's not a goal. Like he'll get pinned in a long time, but
Oh
Fox is
yeah,
very
yeah.
good at but he's very good at kind of just preventing damage as much as he can. And Fox is the one that springs the rush. And like that's what Keandre
Hmm.
Miller is really good at too. And Truba, like for all his flaws, he has his moments with creating rush offense. And he's like the one defenseman outside of Fox there that kind of has a good kind of knows what to do in the offensive zone, like shooting for deflections and not just taking low the low percentage shot. But
He does do that a lot, though. I know he
yeah, he
does.
does. Yeah, he does. I think, but he's better than some of the other guys. But I just do wonder if guys like Sznajder start to get better with that, and Zach Jones. Like I don't really know much about him just because I've been following prospects that much, but I think he's supposed to have some high end. He has some high end skill there that they could
Yeah.
potentially develop, and yeah, I was against the Sharks, like the game I'm watching now, like how they got their first goal. It was they were in the defensive zone for a while, and Kreider and Hedel were out there. Shemek fell down. Hedel got behind him and got a rush goal off a 2-on-1. So
Mm-hmm.
there's still a lot of that in them, and it's just a matter of kind of. I think Shesterkin's going to hold up. I don't know if he's going to be like otherworldly as he was last year. That's the other kind of pressing issue there,
Right.
because if he's a
Yeah.
little worse, I don't know how much worse the team is going to be. But yeah, I think like the defense and goaltending issues are going to hold up. It's just a matter of figuring out kind of how to convert possession to goals when it's not just Panarin creating magic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something like Trocheck, I think, will help with, but he's very hot. Going by what he did in Carolina, he's very hot and cold because he had games where his line was like the best on the team, and he had games where his line was the worst on the team too, from just wasted
Mm-hmm.
offense and defensive zone miscues and bad penalty killing. So he's very hot and cold. So I think figuring that out is going to be the next step for them. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to be fine. They're going to be in the playoffs. I don't really know who is good and who's bad in the Metro right now, aside from Pittsburgh's obviously going to be there, and Pittsburgh's obviously going to be there. Carolina's looked very good to start the year too, but yeah, the Rangers should be top three. I don't see any reason why they can't beat Washington, the Island. Well, they did lose to the Islanders yesterday.
Right. Yeah. I
But
don't know if the Islanders' success is sustainable.
Mm,
Like that's just that
I
style of play is. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know. The Islanders, they kind of got off to a rough start too, but they won yesterday's game,
Of
so we'll
course. Yeah.
see. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they shut the door. Like just the way that one played out was. The way they play in the defensive zone and the way they win against the Rangers is like this is the same exact thing every time. They just box them out, keep everything to the outside, and then the goalie comes up big when he has to. That's it. And then
yeah, but yeah, it's early, so
right. It's early, and I wouldn't jump to any conclusions. Like that's not what you don't do that, right? Like
it's
with your
hard to
data.
do.
You're
Yeah,
not going on Twitter saying like, "Oh my gosh, look at this! Like, look at all these zone entries the Hurricanes have. They're the best team in the league.
yeah, it's very tough. Like
Stanley
as
Cup parade, book it."
Yeah, it's very tough. Like because like I run a subscription based service, and you want data out there, but it's also like, hey, this is like 8 games. Like this is
Yeah.
one playoff series worth of data here. So like, don't like jump to conclusions on it. But
Hmm.
you're also like you have to work with something, Like you can only go by what you see so far and what's happening so far.
All right.
And sometimes like a team like Vancouver that's in a rut right now, like that's something like, yeah, you can start to panic with them because they haven't won
Yeah.
a game and it's almost Halloween, but still, you have to kind of go off something, and that's where this time of year is always kind of the most frustrating for people that are into for the whole like eye test versus stats debate.
Yeah, and also at Vancouver too, one last note is just like they had leads in what was it, first 4 games, maybe first 5 games, and they
Mhm.
lost all of them. That's just sad. Like that's man, that's a bit unfortunate. That's not the way you want to start a season. I mean, there's losing
No,
games, but then there's losing every game that you're winning is
yeah, just Carolina. We played them. Well, they played them earlier this week, and they hung tough in that game, and then Carolina scored 2 goals in the first minute of the second period, and
yep,
it was over. Or
there it
third
is.
period. Yeah,
There
that's
it
just what
is.
happens when you're a bad team. Like,
Yeah. I think yeah, and I think I don't think Vancouver's there yet. They got good players. I love some of their players, but I don't think they're there yet. Maybe in a year or two or something. I don't know. But anyways, Corey, really appreciate you coming on. This is great. I learned a lot from you. Go subscribe to all 3 zones, right? Patreon, right? Is that what you have? Go ahead, plug
yeah,
yourself.
Yeah, so I have a Patreon, but you can go to all3zones.com, which is kind of just the hub for all of my work now. You can get a link to the Patreon there, a link to all the charts that I have, all the data that I've posted. I have some free samples of from like past playoff seasons and a few players that I think are interesting. And there's also an FAQ there with all the stats that I track, what they mean, why I track them, which I feel like I need to plug a lot more because people have been asking why I don't have one. And I also write for McKean's Hockey, so once every 2 weeks I'm doing a column there. And I haven't decided what I'm writing about next week, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Ice Cold Takes fans, take it easy. We'll see you guys next week.